147 people were placed on a wooden raft and pushed out to sea. The officers took the lifeboats. Within 4 days, fewer than 70 were still alive. They hadn't drowned, they hadn't starved, they had killed each other. And the ones who survived ate the ones who didn't. 13 days, 132 dead, 15 survivors. This is not a myth. This is not a metaphor. This happened. The French government tried to bury it. 2 survivors refused to let them. And a 27-year-old painter decided to make it impossible to forget. He went to the morgue. He brought body parts back to his studio. He kept a severed human head on the roof for 2 weeks, painting it every day as it decayed. He needed to know exactly what death looks like, not what artists imagined death looked like, what it actually looks like. He painted for 18 months. He died convinced the painting wasn't important. The world disagreed. Théodore Géricault, born in Rouen, France, in 1791. He came from money. His father was a successful tobacco merchant. His mother died when he was 17. He was supposed to enter the family business. Instead, he lied to his father for years, pretending to work as a clerk while secretly training as a painter. He had no patience for rules. He got himself banned from the Louvre for assaulting a fellow student during a disagreement. He was obsessed with horses, drew them constantly, kept several for his own use, painted them with more precision than almost any artist of his era. He was also deeply unstable. His mood swung between periods of intense productivity and complete collapse. His contemporaries described him as someone who lived at the edge of everything, incapable of doing anything at half the intensity. And then he made a decision that would follow him for the rest of his life. He fell in love with his aunt, not by blood, by marriage. Alexandrine Modeste Carouel was the young wife of his uncle, 6 years older than Géricault, 28 years younger than her husband. The affair lasted years. It produced a child. When the family found out, the child was taken away. The lovers were separated. Géricault never met his son. He was 25 years old, carrying a guilt with no resolution, and looking for somewhere to put it. He found the story of the Medusa. July 1816. The French frigate Medusa set sail for Senegal, over 400 people on board. The captain, Hugues du Roy de Chaumareix, hadn't commanded a ship in 20 years. He had the position because he was loyal to the crown, not because he could navigate. He ran the ship aground on a sandbank 60 miles off the coast of West Africa. A decision had to be made. The lifeboats had room for 250 people. There were 400 on board. The officers took the boats. 147 people, men and 1 woman, were loaded onto a makeshift raft barely the size of a tennis court. The plan was for the boats to tow the raft to shore. The tow lines were cut within hours. Whether by accident or by decision, the officers never agreed, and no one on the raft survived who could prove what happened. The raft drifted free. Day 1. People fell off the edges during the night, the waves, the panic. Day 2. Fighting broke out for positions toward the center. The weak were pushed overboard. Day 4. Fewer than 70 remained. They had been without food since the beginning. The wine was almost gone. And they made a decision that none of them would ever describe clearly in the accounts they later gave. They ate the dead. On day 8, the 15 strongest threw the rest overboard to preserve what little remained. On day 13, a passing ship spotted them by chance. Not by rescue operation, by chance. 15 alive, 132 dead. The French government was briefed and immediately moved to contain the story. 2 survivors refused to stay silent: a surgeon named Savigny, an engineer named Correard. They wrote a book, every detail, the incompetence of the captain, the cutting of the tow lines, the fighting, what happened to the bodies. It became a bestseller. The government pressured publishers. Copies were confiscated. The authors were harassed. The captain was eventually put on trial. What should have been a death sentence was reduced to 3 years in prison. He served them. He was released. He lived another 20 years. By the time Géricault started painting, the captain was already free. That is what drove him. Not just the tragedy of what happened on the raft, the fact that the people responsible walked away from it. He was 26. He had a guilt of his own he couldn't resolve. A child he'd never be allowed to know. A family that had quietly closed the door on what he'd done. And here was a crime where power had protected itself completely. He decided the painting would be the thing power couldn't bury. He found the 2 survivors who had written the book. He interviewed them at length. He had the carpenter who built the original raft construct an exact scale model. He went to the prison hospital at Beaujon to study the faces of the dying, the specific way exhaustion changes a face, the way the eyes look when the body is almost done. And then he went to the morgue. He went back again and again. He studied the colour of skin at different stages after death, the precise grey that comes in the hours afterward, the changes that happen over days. And then he brought pieces of it home: severed arms, severed legs, a head. His first biographer, Charles Clément, wrote that Géricault kept numerous corpses in his studio, as well as a severed head that he stored on the roof and painted daily as it decomposed. Friends who visited during this period described the smell, described the shock of seeing human remains arranged like still life references on his work tables. Géricault did not flinch. He was looking for something specific, not shock, not horror, accuracy. He wanted the bodies in the painting to look the way bodies actually look, not the way artists had agreed to paint them, the way they actually are. He painted for 18 months. When the canvas was finished, it was nearly 5 meters wide. It was the most ambitious painting a French artist of his generation had attempted. And when it was done, he didn't know if it had worked. Look at the painting, not the chaos first, the structure. Géricault built it as a pyramid. At the base, the dead, men sprawled across the timbers, face down, face up, limbs at angles that bodies only reach when the muscles have completely stopped. The skin tones are not what you'd expect from a painting of this era. They're not dramatized. They're not idealized. They're the color of what he studied on those rooftops and in those hospital corridors. Above the dead, the dying. Men slumped, propped against each other, staring at nothing, still alive, but not in any way that feels hopeful. And above them, at the peak of the pyramid, a black man, Jean-Charles, one of the actual survivors. He is the only figure standing fully upright. He is waving a piece of cloth toward the horizon. In 1819, placing a black man at the summit of a major French painting as the symbol of hope was a political statement. France was deeply involved in the slave trade. Géricault knew what he was doing. Now look at the horizon. There is a ship there, small, almost invisible. You might miss it the first time, That is the Argus, the ship that would eventually rescue them. But look at the angle of the raft. It's turning away from the ship. The men at the top are waving towards something they can barely see, and the raft itself is drifting in the wrong direction. Géricault painted hope and futility in the same image. At the same moment, he did not paint the rescue. He did not paint the worst days on the raft. He painted the single moment when the outcome was still completely unknown. That choice is what makes the painting impossible to leave. When the painting was shown at the Paris Salon in 1819, the critics called it grotesque, indecent, an inappropriate subject for serious art. The public couldn't stop looking at it, but almost no one talked about the specific choice Géricault had made. He didn't paint the storm. He didn't paint the murders. He didn't paint the moment of rescue. He painted the moment before knowing. That fraction of a second when you have spotted something on the horizon, and you still don't know if it's coming towards you or moving away. That is the specific kind of suffering that the painting is actually about. Not starvation, not violence, the not knowing, suspended between two possibilities, unable to act, unable to stop hoping. Art historians have pointed out that when Géricault was painting this, he was living inside that same suspension. The affair had ended. The child was gone. His career was unproven. He had done something he couldn't undo, and he didn't know what it meant yet for who he was going to become. He didn't put himself in the painting. He put his condition in it. The moment before you know whether what you did destroyed you or made you. That is what you're looking at when you stand in front of this canvas. The French government refused to buy the painting. Géricault took it to London. Over 50,000 people paid to see it. He came back to Paris and slowly came apart. His health had never been stable. The riding accidents came in quick succession. 3 serious falls within a year. An abscess formed on his spine. He made one impulsive decision that accelerated everything. He tried to lance the abscess himself with a kitchen needle. The infection spread. In his final months, a psychiatrist named Georges brought him into his ward and introduced him to patients suffering from specific mental obsessions. Géricault painted 10 portraits, each one named after a fixed delusion: the monomaniac of envy, the monomaniac of theft, the monomaniac of military command. He painted people whose minds had turned against them with great precision and no condescension. He died on January 26, 1824, 32 years old, on his deathbed. When someone mentioned the Raft of the Medusa, he dismissed it. Bah, une vignette. Just a sketch. He meant it. 132 people died on that raft. A captain walked free. A 27-year-old painter with a studio full of decaying body parts and a guilt he couldn't resolve decided that at least the painting would make it impossible to forget. He painted the moment before knowing. Not the disaster, not the survival, the suspended second in between, the one that feels the longest when you're living through it. He put everything he had into that canvas and died certain it amounted to nothing. The painting is still in the Louvre, nearly 5 meters wide. It has been there for over 200 years. The painting watched. It still watches. It never stopped. Most people walk through the Louvre and stop in front of the Mona Lisa. The Raft of the Medusa is a few rooms away. 5 meters of death and desperation painted by a man who kept human remains on his roof to make sure he got it right. Most people glance at it and move on. They see a shipwreck. They don't see the moment he chose to paint, or why he chose that moment. Most people look at paintings. Very few actually see them. This is inside the artwork.